What happens to an empire when its greatest warriors die faster than they can be replaced? What happens when the armies built over decades, even centuries, are wiped out in a single afternoon, and the only way to survive is to build soldiers faster than nature ever intended? In the aftermath of the Dropsite massacre, that question stopped being theory. It became a reality the legions were forced to confront with shaking hands, broken armor, and gene labs humming with unnatural purpose. The galaxy after Istvan V was not the galaxy the Emperor built. It was a wound, open, infected, bleeding across every star system. Loyalist forces were shattered. Traitor legions were emboldened. The balance of power cracked like ancient marble under a hammer strike, and the shockwaves spread across military outposts, forge worlds, and fortress monasteries. Entire legions were obliterated in hours. Veteran Astartes who had shaped the galaxy on the Great Crusade were reduced to ashes on black sand. Primarchs fell, one after another, to betrayal and overwhelming force. For the first time since the Emperor set foot in the stars, mankind's greatest warriors were dying faster than indoctrination, training, and gene seed implantation could ever hope to replace them. And this was the moment the Imperium and its enemies realized something horrifying. Space Marines could be broken, and Space Marines could run out. This was unthinkable. The legions Astartes were not supposed to know attrition. They were the lightning strike that ended wars in seconds, the walking myths that shattered empires, the sons of gods who reshaped reality through force of will alone. But after the massacre, even the strongest legionaries stared at their dwindling numbers and understood. The next battle could end everything. The Primarchs felt this dread first. Some hid it behind iron discipline, some behind rage, some behind cold, almost surgical logic. But deep down, they all saw the same truth. Their sons were dying, and the war was far from over. What happens to a demigod when he realizes he does not have enough blood left to win? He cheats. He bends the rules he once treated as sacred. He cuts corners. He makes decisions he would have called heresy only months before. And that is where the Inductii were born. Not from strategy, not from vision, not from hope, from desperation. Picture the state of the Imperium in that moment. Loyalist enclaves isolated behind enemy lines, recruitment worlds bombarded from orbit, mechanicum forges torn between alliances, and warp storms spiraling across supply chains. Reinforcements became myths. Ammo convoys vanished. Gene tech shipments fell into traitor hands or never arrived at all. The legions who survived Istvan were forced to rebuild their forces in months, not decades. They needed warriors now. Not tomorrow, not next year, not after a decade of training and surgical implantation. Astartes' creation normally required precision, patience, and a near-religious adherence to genetic ritual. But war does not wait for rituals. So the Primarchs, the gene cults, and the legion surgeons opened doors long kept locked. They dusted off sealed protocols. They tapped into research never meant to be used. They reached into the darkest corners of science. And they created soldiers in ways no one should ever create a soldier. The Inductii were not aspirants raised with honor. They were not recruits dreaming of glory. They were not children molded slowly into warriors. They were forged quickly and brutally, like weapons hammered from unstable metal. Some legions went further than others. Some produced these warriors reluctantly. Others embraced the process with fanatical zeal, eager to replenish their ranks with fresh bodies molded exactly as they wished. The first experiments ran too fast, bodies grew too quickly, minds destabilized, gene seed organs failed under stress. But the war outside was growing worse by the day, and failed Inductii were simply thrown away while the next batch entered the vats. Veterans looked at these new creations with suspicion. These were not brothers. They were replacements, rushed, imperfect, unstable. Some Inductii arrived already racked with tremors from underdeveloped organs. Some had fused bones, mismatched growth patterns, or violent emotional surges. Others seemed disturbingly blank, shaped by accelerated indoctrination until nothing remained of the person who once lived beneath their new armor. But none of that mattered. The Primarchs needed bodies. The Mechanicum provided solutions that were more improvisation than science. Hypno-indoctrination was sped up. Memory wipes became common. Flash training poured combat instincts directly into neural pathways. Psychic conditioning removed fear by removing entire pieces of identity. What emerged from the gene labs and re-education halls were not fully realized Astartes. They were emergency approximations. Engines of violence capable of following orders and dying on command. Some legions treated their Inductii with pity, others with disdain, some with absolute cruelty. None treated them as equals, because deep down, every veteran understood something they would never say aloud. Inductii were built for the same purpose as ammunition. Expendable, replaceable, necessary. Imagine standing on a war-torn world, wearing armor covered in your fallen brother's blood, watching a new group of recruits march out of the landing craft. Recruits barely 4 years out of infancy, wearing the same colors, holding the same emblem, but lacking the weight behind their eyes. Some look confused, some look eager, some look empty, and all of them have been told that you are their example. But the war does not care about your doubts. The enemy does not care about your ethical dilemmas. The galaxy is burning, and the legions no longer have the luxury of humanity. By this point in the war, no one asked the Inductii who they were before. No one cared about their history, their culture, their aspirations. Those parts were carved out during indoctrination or overwritten entirely. The only question was whether they could hold a bolter without shaking, and whether they would survive long enough to fire it. The tragedy is not that they were created as monsters. The tragedy is that the galaxy demanded monsters and offered no other way to win. And so the Inductii marched into the fire. They were born in darkness, grown in laboratories, taught to fight before they learned to think. They replaced the dead because someone had to. They became the skeleton holding up mutilated legions. They died in droves because their creators had no other choice. Whether they were ever given the chance to become true Astartes is debatable. Whether they deserved better is undeniable. But in those first desperate years after the massacre, the legions did not debate or doubt or regret. They acted, because losing the war meant losing humanity itself. In that kind of universe, ethics are luxuries, and the Inductii were the price. Before dive in Chapter 2, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more updates. Now let's dive straight into Chapter 2. Chapter 2, The Breaking of the Rules, How the Legions Shortcut Evolution. Imagine opening a vault that was never meant to be opened. cracking a seal that generations of gene cult adepts swore would remain untouched. All because the war outside is spiraling so fast that even your Primarch fears running out of time. This is the moment the legions crossed a threshold no one could uncross. This is where the Inductii truly began. Space Marine creation had always been slow by design. It wasn't just tradition. It was biology, psychology, engineering, and ritual woven into a single sacred process. Each aspirant passed through phase after phase: screening, implantation, surgery after surgery, organ growth, indoctrination, supervised combat trials, hypnoconditioning, and the long, patient maturing of gene seed. That took decades. Decades the legions no longer had. After the drop site massacre, recruiting new warriors through the proper channels became a luxury. Too many worlds had burned. Too many aspirants had been killed, captured, or stranded behind enemy lines. The forges were quiet. The fortress monasteries were bleeding. The Primarchs had to choose between preserving the purity of their genetic legacy or surviving. They chose survival. The first sign of this desperation was whispered within the Adeptus Mechanicum. Sealed gene editing protocols quietly reopened, ancient practices unearthed from the dusty archives of old Earth's darkest experiments. These were files marked with red sigils, warnings, entire paragraphs of text scripts explaining that these methods were never to be employed again. But war eats rules, and the heresy devoured them whole. Veteran apothecaries, some of whom had spent centuries perfecting their craft, now found themselves practicing medicine the same way a blacksmith patches a broken cart. Hammering, welding, improvising, rushing. Implants designed to grow gradually were forced to bloom in months. Neural scaffolds were jump-started with electro-indoctrination. Hormonally accelerated growth turned adolescent recruits into hulking armored giants almost overnight. It was as if someone took the Space Marine creation process, shredded the instruction manual, and rewrote it under battlefield fire. The consequences were immediate. Some Inductii developed organs faster than their bodies could adapt, leading to chronic internal strain. Hearts designed to pump transhuman blood for centuries began stuttering under the rapid metabolics. Osmodula-stimulated bones overgrew, curving unnaturally or fusing in ways that caused constant pain. Some aspirants were discarded mid-process because their bodies simply couldn't keep pace with the forced evolution. But the Primarchs demanded speed, not stability. So the legions pushed harder. Neophytes who should have spent years in hypno-training chambers instead received condensed indoctrination. Compressed learning blocks meant to overwrite identity, memory, and willpower with a single purpose: obedience and battle readiness. The flashes of combat memory injected into their minds were intended to simulate experience they never had time to earn. Sometimes the procedure worked. Other times the recruit woke up screaming, unable to distinguish real memories from artificial ones. In the worst cases, the neophyte forgot their own name entirely. Yet even that was considered acceptable. A warrior without identity was easier to control. Some Inductii emerged blank-faced and eerily calm, their personalities reduced to brittle shells. Others oscillated between rage and confusion, overwhelmed by the flood of implanted instincts. A few suffered seizures so violent that their limbs tore free of surgical restraints. Still, the process continued. Because the alternative was extinction, the legions began to study each shortcut closely, measuring every risk. If an experiment produced one stable warrior out of 10, it was declared a success. If a technique killed recruits but shaved weeks off development, it was adopted anyway. If a gene splice made a candidate dangerously aggressive but physically strong, commanders called it acceptable variance. This wasn't evolution. This was assembly line warfare. Veteran commanders used to pride themselves on selecting the best candidates from warrior tribes across the galaxy. Now they selected whoever could survive the initial implantation procedures. In some places, aspirants didn't even volunteer. They were drafted, seized, or taken from conquered populations. In others, the legions relied on whatever fragment of humanity had survived local devastation, no matter how unprepared or unwilling. The purity of the gene seed, once the most sacred trust of a legion, began to erode. Instability spread, hidden behind armor plates and battlefield efficiency. Astartes were not supposed to be flawed, but the Inductii carried flaws like seeds of future ruin embedded in their tissues. The physiology wasn't the only thing compromised. Psychologically, the Inductii were a patchwork of untested indoctrination methods. Hypnoblocks that normally took years to settle were slammed into place in days. Identity suppression sequences ran too fast, leaving recruits with jagged gaps in memory. Combat instincts were shoved into their minds like foreign software, often clashing with whatever remained of their original personalities. Veteran legionaries sensed something was wrong. They saw Inductii who reacted too slowly to pain or too violently to stimuli. They watched new recruits tremble after hearing their Primarch's voice, unsure whether to kneel or salute. Some Inductii developed tics or compulsions, subtle signs of neural conflict. Others became dangerously single-minded, obeying orders with frightening literalism. If a commander said, "Take that fortress at any cost," an Inductii might charge the walls alone, interpreting the command as absolute. This made them unpredictable, unstable, deadly even to allies. And yet, time and time again, these broken creations marched into slaughter and delivered what was required. Bodies on the line, bolters firing, objectives seized, enemies thrown back by sheer force of numbers. The Primarchs understood the risks. They accepted them anyway, because the war demanded victory, not perfection. Gene labs once dedicated to slow, meticulous craftsmanship now resembled war factories. Biovats hummed with synthetic growth mediums. Surgical teams worked in shifts without rest. Indoctrination chambers glowed with psychic energy. Forgerites retooled mechanical arms to implant organs at industrial speed. The legions were not rebuilding themselves. They were rebuilding something new, something harsher, something born without childhood, culture, or choice. Every Inductii was a reminder of how far the legions had fallen from their ideals, and how far they were willing to go to survive. The old doctrines were broken. The purity of the gene lines was compromised. The identity of the legions was shifting into something desperate and unrecognizable. This was no longer the Great Crusade. This was the heresy. And in the heresy, even space marines were disposable. The creation of the Inductii was not a stroke of genius. It was a warning signal, a red flare in the darkness that said, "We are losing." And when an empire is losing, it does not create heroes. It creates whatever it needs, even monsters. Chapter 3: Unloved Sons. how the legions treated their own creations. Imagine walking into a fortress monastery as a newly minted space marine and watching every veteran in the room look at you the way a soldier looks at a faulty weapon. Not with hatred, not with disgust, but with a quiet, unsettling doubt, the kind that says, "You're not one of us. You're a shortcut, compromise, a reminder of everything we lost." That was the life of an Inductii. Their first battles weren't fought against the enemy. They were fought in the eyes of the brothers they were created to replace. Astartes' culture had always valued heritage, lineage, honor, and the slow forging of warrior souls. Veterans could name the worlds where their aspirants were found, the trials they survived, the rites that shaped them. They carried songs, scars, and stories born from decades of shared battles. Inductii had none of that. They had no childhood, no culture, no connection to the legion's past. Their identities were pre-cut, mass-produced, stamped out by machines and indoctrination. They didn't grow into space marines. They were assembled into them, and the legions felt that difference instantly. Most veterans treated the Inductii with a distant politeness, a strained tolerance. They followed orders, fought beside them, and acknowledged their presence. But there was always a barrier, a hesitation, a question hanging in the air. Will these new bloods break when things get hard? Some predicted they wouldn't even last a year. Others whispered about failures, deformities, sudden breakdowns. A few simply refused to fight alongside them unless forced. To the veterans, the Inductii weren't younger brothers. They were shadows wearing the armor of the dead. This emotional rift grew wider as the Inductii's flaws became obvious. Many were unstable, not malicious, not rebellious, just unfinished. Their minds felt raw, like clay that hadn't fully hardened. Their bodies were powerful but inconsistent, lacking the fine-tuned resilience of a naturally ascended Astartes. Some Inductii hesitated when receiving orders because their indoctrination hadn't fully sealed. Some interpreted commands with dangerous literalism. Some reacted too strongly to stress. Not fear, but an overcorrection, an explosive surge of aggression. Veterans noticed everything. A twitch in the jaw during formation. A tremor in the hand before drawing a combat blade. A delayed response in the heat of battle. A lack of emotional context when responding to tragedy or camaraderie. These things mattered deeply within the legions. Space Marines weren't just killers. They were brothers forged through ritual, culture, and shared legacy. But the Inductii had no roots. They had no silent language built from centuries of tradition. They didn't know the chants, the jokes, the subtle gestures that passed between squad mates. They were strangers wearing familiar colors. And war doesn't give time to build trust. This mistrust shaped the roles Inductii were given. Many commanders quietly placed them at the front of formations. Test their courage, they said. Measure their loyalty. But everyone understood the truth. Inductii were being used as buffers. When a ship boarded, Inductii were the first into the breach. When a traitor bastion needed testing, Inductii advanced first. When the warp spawned horrors no one wanted to face, Inductii were sent in to see what lived inside. Their bodies were valuable. Their lives were not. Some legions justified this with harsh pragmatism. Resources must be spent where they matter least. Others genuinely believed the Inductii deserved a chance to earn their place, but that chance involved surviving what would have killed a veteran Astartes. If an Inductii lived long enough, gained experience, and proved themselves in repeated battles, the veterans would eventually accept them as equals. But few survived that long. For every 100 created, only a handful lived past their first campaign. Many died in ways that didn't even earn a name on the casualty lists. They simply vanished, buried under wreckage, vaporized by plasma, torn apart in the melee, or consumed by warp anomalies. Their commanders rarely mourned them, not because they were heartless, but because mourning was reserved for brothers, and most Inductii never became brothers before death claimed them. The tragedy is that many Inductii wanted nothing more than belonging. Some tried to mimic veteran behavior. Some memorized Legion histories desperately, hoping to fit in. A few imitated accents, speech patterns, and combat stances, trying to look properly Astartes. It rarely worked. Veterans saw through the imitation instantly. There were exceptions. Some legions treated their Inductii with stern but genuine guidance. Commanders who believed every life mattered, even lives made in a rush. Squads who embraced their new members and trained them as fiercely as any aspirant. Moments of real brotherhood did occur. Flashes of humanity shining through the war. But even in these accepting legions, the Inductii still carried a stigma. They were reminders of loss, of defeat, of emergency, of the fact that the legions were collapsing so fast that they had to break their own sacred rules just to keep fighting. The Primarchs themselves set the tone. Some ignored Inductii entirely, treating them as logistical necessities rather than sons. Some viewed them with sadness, knowing each one represented a fallen warrior they failed to protect. Some saw them as tools, not inherently evil, but intended for use, not celebration. And a few embraced them with frightening enthusiasm, seeing the Inductii as blank slates they could shape into perfect weapons. The Inductii themselves sensed these attitudes. They were not stupid. They were not naive. They felt the distance. They heard the whispers. They understood the expectations. And slowly, something internal began to shift. Some grew fiercely loyal to their legion, fighting with almost manic determination to prove their worth. These warriors often became the most fearless soldiers on the battlefield, because they believed every moment alive was a chance to erase the stain of their unnatural birth. Others hardened emotionally, withdrawing behind a mask of rigid professionalism. They decided belonging didn't matter, only victory did. A few tragically broke. Their half-formed identities couldn't handle the constant pressure, mistrust, and accelerated indoctrination. Some succumbed to psychological collapse. Some lashed out. Some simply froze in battle, their minds fracturing under stress. Those ones never returned from the field. In the end, the legions never truly solved the dilemma of the Inductii. They needed them, they depended on them, but they didn't trust them. And the Inductii fought every battle knowing they were trying to earn a place in a brotherhood that might never accept them. They were not monsters. They were not heroes. They were something far more painful. They were sons born into a family that didn't ask for them. And in the fires of the Horus Heresy, that made their struggle more heartbreaking than any battle they fought. Chapter 4: The Loyalist Approach. Discipline, Tradition, and Desperation. What does a legion do when the galaxy is burning? Their brothers are dead, and the only reinforcements they receive are warriors forged too fast, too roughly, too unnaturally. Some meet them with discipline, some with compassion, some with cold calculation, but all Loyalist legions faced the same unbearable reality. They could not win the war without these imperfect sons. Each legion had a culture, a rhythm, a long-standing identity shaped by centuries of ritual and brotherhood. To integrate the Inductii into these traditions was like trying to stitch raw iron into silk. Yet the Loyalists had no choice. Their numbers were shattered, supply lines crippled, and enemies closing in from all sides. How each legion responded revealed more about their souls than any battle ever could. The first legion, the Dark Angels, handled their Inductii with a kind of quiet, grim practicality. They did not waste time with emotional attachment or resentment. They did not lament the loss of purity. They treated Inductii the way they treated every weapon in their arsenal. Use it well, expect it to break, replace it when necessary. Yet beneath their stoic facade, there was something deeper, a strict internal separation. The Inductii were given archaic Volkite weaponry and deployed without being told the Legion's greatest secrets. Not out of cruelty, but out of instinctive caution. The First Legion carried hidden wounds, hidden sins, and hidden truths. They had no intention of exposing these to recruits born from emergency measures. To the Dark Angels, trust was earned slowly, painfully, deliberately. The Inductii had no time to earn anything. Still, when the Crusade of Vengeance began, the Inductii marched beside them, filling the gaps left by fallen veterans. They fought with eagerness, desperate to prove themselves worthy of the First Legion's cold gaze. Many died before their brothers even learned their names. The White Scars took a different path. To Jagatai Khan, purity of lineage mattered far less than the spirit of the warrior before him. The White Scars were pragmatic, shaped by the wild philosophy of Kagurus. Strength found in the storm, loyalty found in shared battle. Their Inductii, called New Bloods, were not expected to mimic ancient rituals immediately. Instead, they were tested through action, speed, and adaptability. At first, they were thrown into Karash formations, vanguard units meant to break enemy lines through shock and velocity. The White Scars watched how these New Bloods rode, fought, and died. Those who survived learned the rhythms of the hunt, the winds of war, the thrill of movement. And slowly, astonishingly, some Inductii began to carry themselves like true sons of the Kagan. They painted their armor with Chagorian patterns. They chanted with their brothers during thunderous charges. They blended the rawness of their accelerated upbringing with the fierce freedom of the Legion. By the time they reached Terra, Inductii were fighting at the heart of White Scar formations. The Khan did not care how they were born. He cared how they rode into battle, and whether their blades sang with courage. The Imperial Fists treated their Inductii with a severity that bordered on unforgiving, but never crossed into cruelty. Rogel Dorn demanded perfection from all his sons, new or old. But he understood the necessity of the Inductii better than most, because the siege of Terra loomed like a shadow over every Imperial Fist campaign. On Terra, Inductii were taught siegecraft with mechanical precision, how to hold a wall, reinforce a bulwark, operate artillery, and become a human and transhuman extension of fortification. They were molded not into free-thinking warriors, but into architecture with veins, muscle, and armor. On Chthoniya, however, where some Imperial Fists tried to recruit from the shattered sons of Horus territories, the indoctrination took a darker turn. Candidates were drilled relentlessly, forced to shed any trace of their previous allegiance. Dorn's sons demanded absolute obedience, absolute focus, absolute devotion. The Inductii who survived this process emerged not as soldiers, but as stone, unyielding, unmoving, unbreakable until the moment their bodies gave out. Then came the Blood Angels, perhaps the most tragic case of all. Their gene seed carried a flaw that haunted them: the red thirst. Normally, aspirants received psychological conditioning to help suppress it, to maintain control during the heat of battle. The Inductii did not receive this conditioning. Whether due to time restraints, disrupted supply chains, or sheer desperation, the mental safeguards were simply not installed. So their red thirst bloomed unchecked, raw and violent, like wildfire ripping through their minds. Some Blood Angels veterans watched these Inductii with pity, seeing the sons they never wanted to create, yet forced to command. Others saw them as a necessary evil, a weapon of last resort, and some deep down feared them. The Inductii fought like animals driven by hunger, driven by instinct, driven by a darkness the Legion had spent millennia trying to master. But when the skies over Terra burned, the Blood Angels needed every sword, every bolter, every warrior, and the Inductii charged into the fire with terrifying fervor. The Iron Hands took the most mechanized approach, unsurprising for a legion defined by logic and the cold rejection of weakness. After the drop site massacre, they were a wounded animal, desperate and furious. They produced Inductii in massive numbers, adding cybernetic enhancements when biological organs were scarce. They did not soften their training. They did not hide their contempt for flesh. They did not mourn the failures. Iron Hands Inductii often entered battle with bolters reinforced by steel plating, bayonets serrated for trench warfare, and phosphex bombs strapped to their armor. They were walking engines of attrition, crafted for brutal engagements where survival was measured in minutes, not hours. The Inductii's lack of identity meant nothing to the Iron Fathers. Identity was weakness. Emotion was weakness. Only function mattered. And in their cold logic, the Inductii functioned. Other Loyalist legions responded with their own blend of urgency and sorrow. The Ultramarines integrated Inductii with structured efficiency, treating them as soldiers to be shaped by discipline and doctrine. The Salamanders treated them with compassion, trying, often failing, to give them dignity. The Raven Guard, shattered by tragedy, used them sparingly and quietly, seeing too much of their own suffering reflected in these hastily made recruits. Despite these differences, one truth united all Loyalists: the Inductii were essential, not honorable, not ideal, not pure, but essential. Their existence was a compromise forced upon the legions at the worst possible moment in human history. Without them, entire campaigns would have collapsed. Without them, the siege of Terra would have been lost before it began. Without them, countless systems would have fallen to traitors and nightmares. And yet, the emotional divide remained. Veterans still felt the sting of loss every time they looked at these artificial suns. Inductii still carried the quiet ache of being born into a brotherhood that didn't ask for them. The Loyalists did not create the Inductii out of malice. They created them out of necessity. But necessity has a way of wounding the soul. And for the Inductii, that wound never fully healed. Chapter 5, The Traitor Legions, when Inductii became experiments. If the Loyalists strained the limits of morality to create Inductii, the Traitor Legions snapped those limits in half and ground them into dust. For the War Master's fallen sons, desperation wasn't a burden. It was freedom. The old rules were dead. The Emperor's laws were ash. The sanctity of the human form was just another superstition to be discarded. What mattered now was power. What mattered was victory. And the Inductii became raw material for whatever nightmare each traitor legion desired. Where the Loyalists tried to maintain discipline, culture, and purpose, the traitors unleashed their Inductii into a world of cruelty, mutation, and unchecked experimentation. These weren't soldiers created in a hurry. They were test subjects, and the results were horrifying. Picture a World Eater's gene forge. Not a surgical hall, not a laboratory, but a butcher's den disguised as science. Red-lit chambers filled with the metallic stench of blood and chemical accelerants. Rows of growing vats where recruits floated in nutrient gel, their bodies twitching as gene seed took hold at unnatural speed. Servitors stalked the aisles, scanning each candidate for combat viability. Those deemed too weak were recycled. Those who screamed too long were discarded. The quiet ones, the ones whose bodies accepted the process, were marked for induction into Angren's brutal vision. These were not warriors being shaped. They were animals being bred. Once pulled from the vats, the recruits were shoved into pits filled with broken blades, spiked chains, and the bodies of those who had failed the day before. They were expected to fight before they even understood what they were fighting for. The World Eaters called this training. Everyone else would call it barbarism. The butcher surgeons monitored every moment, their masked faces gleaming with sick fascination. They weren't interested in teaching techniques or discipline. They wanted to see who would survive the frenzy, who would tear, bite, claw, and rip their way into becoming a true son of Angren. Many Inductii didn't survive the first hour. The ones who did emerged covered in wounds, trembling with adrenaline, their minds already bending toward violence. Then came the butcher's nails. Installing those cursed implants into fully developed Astartes was already a violation of everything human. Installing them directly into unstable, rapidly grown Inductii was something far worse. Their neural networks weren't prepared for the constant screaming of the nails, the endless demand for slaughter, the pain that erupted with every heartbeat. Some died instantly, some went insane. Some rose with an emptiness behind their eyes that even veteran berserkers found unsettling. The World Eaters didn't mourn them. They simply dragged out the next batch. If the World Eaters treated their Inductii like beasts, the Emperor's children approached theirs like twisted artists. Their gene labs were immaculate, gleaming with surgical purity. Crystal vials, polished metal tables, soft lighting. It looked like a place of healing. But beneath that beauty was a darkness far worse than anything in the World Eater's pits. The Three Legion didn't want warriors. They wanted perfection, and they were willing to carve it out of screaming flesh. Inductii within the Emperor's children were reshaped like sculptures. Chem implants replaced natural glands. flooding their bodies with drugs designed to sharpen reflexes while dulling fear. Flesh was sculpted, nerves were rerouted, limbs were replaced with enhanced substitutes. Every modification pushed the recruit closer to an impossible aesthetic standard that Fulgrim's corrupted vision demanded. Those who didn't match the ideal were altered again, and again, and again, until they broke or became something unrecognizable. The Emperor's children didn't see this as cruelty. They saw it as improvement, as art. Their Inductii weren't given a place within the Legion's culture. They were molded into it, piece by unnatural piece, until their minds cracked under the pressure of becoming the perfect warrior. The Night Lords took a simpler approach, but one no less terrifying. Their Inductii were brutalized psychologically before their bodies ever touched gene seed. The 8th Legion believed fear was the purest path to obedience. So recruits were subjected to rounds of terror conditioning, sensory deprivation, hallucination exposure, forced confrontation with their worst memories, and ritual humiliation by a legion that had long lost any connection to restraint or empathy. Night Lords Inductii didn't learn discipline. They learned fear. Not fear of the enemy, fear of their own brothers. That fear twisted them, hollowed them out, and left them with two paths: become a predator or become prey. Most chose the former. The rest vanished. Then there were the Iron Warriors, bitter and cold as the metal they worshipped. Their approach was almost clinical. They didn't mutilate Inductii for pleasure. They re-engineered them for utility. Cybernetic limbs were grafted onto them when flesh failed to adapt. Grenade harnesses were built directly into their armor. They were designed as siege equipment with hearts. A failed Inductii was not a tragedy. It was a defective part. The Alpha Legion, ever enigmatic, approached their Inductii with a whispering subtlety that made them impossible to categorize. Some were taught infiltration. Some were taught sabotage. Some were implanted with false memories. Some were conditioned to believe they were ordinary legionaries born through normal processes. And some never knew they were Inductii at all. The Alpha Legion didn't care about purity or stability. They cared about utility, deception, and adaptability. Their Inductii were shaped into tools for a war only the Hydra understood. But the most unsettling truth of all was this: every traitor legion pushed the Inductii further than the Loyalists ever dared. Where Loyalists feared losing their identity, traitors eagerly embraced mutation. Where Loyalists mourned the loss of brothers, traitors replaced them with experiments. Where Loyalists worried about psychological stability, traitors saw instability as opportunity. The Inductii in the traitor legions weren't simply new soldiers. They were prototypes, templates, sketches of nightmares yet to come. A Night Lord Inductii might end up clad in flayed skin. A World Eater Inductii might become a living storm of violence. An Emperor's Children Inductii might be sculpted until they resembled a creature of perfection-bound madness more than a space marine. An Iron Warrior Inductii might be half-machine by the time he entered battle. And the Alpha Legion? Their Inductii might never know they were Inductii, or might believe everyone else was. Some Inductii found purpose in this chaos. Some reveled in it. Some became legendary in their own right. But more often, they were simply consumed. Consumed by the war. Consumed by the experiments. Consumed by legions that saw them not as brothers, but as malleable flesh. The Loyalists created Inductii with regret. The traitors created Inductii with enthusiasm. And in the end, both sides paid the price. The Inductii were never meant to exist. They were born because the galaxy was collapsing. They were shaped because the Primarchs no longer had time to wait. But only the traitor legions turned desperation into art, rage, science, and horror, forging a generation of space marines who never had a chance to be anything except what their creators designed. Weapons, experiments, nightmares waiting to be unleashed. Chapter 6: Minds Rewritten. Indoctrination, Identity Death, and Flash Training. Imagine waking up and realizing you don't remember your name. Not because of trauma, not because of amnesia, but because someone deliberately carved it out of your mind to make room for a war you never chose. For the Inductii, this wasn't a rare tragedy. It was the first step of their creation. To be born as an Inductii was to step into a system designed to erase everything human and replace it with something efficient, obedient, and lethal. The legions, loyalist and traitor alike, did not have time for philosophy or spiritual guidance. They needed bodies that could fight, minds that could be controlled, instincts that could be shaped without hesitation. And so, the process began with silence. A young recruit, sometimes a teenager, sometimes barely older, would be strapped into a cold metal cradle, lumens buzzing overhead. The chamber would feel like a cross between a surgical suite and a cathedral stripped of its warmth. Runes flickered softly across consoles. Mechanicum servitors clanked in the shadows. Apothecaries whispered to one another in clipped tones. The recruit would try to ask a question, but questions were irrelevant. The indoctrination engines were already humming. One by one, pieces of his identity would be peeled away. First memories, then attachments, then doubts, then anything that didn't serve the Legion. The neural spikes descended like the teeth of a machine god. Psychoelectric pulses surged through the skull. The recruit's past life, family, culture, name, fears, loves, burned away under waves of artificial thought. This wasn't brainwashing. This wasn't teaching. It was replacement. Hypno-indoctrination once took years. For Inductii, took hours. Recruits were submerged into what the legions called thought lattices. Patterns of knowledge etched directly into neural pathways. No teaching, no learning, no comprehension required. Just insertion. Some recruits screamed while the patterns carved themselves into the brain. Some sat still, dazed and empty-eyed. Some convulsed as battle instincts fused with synaptic tissue in ways never meant for human biology. In the old days, hypno-training was supposed to blend seamlessly with an aspirant's developing personality. For Inductii, it slammed in like a hammer. Imagine being forced to forget every moment of your childhood, while a voice whispers into your skull, "The Legion is your father. The Primarch is your blood. The enemy is your purpose." Some resisted at first. A few recruits tried to cling to fragments of themselves. A mother's face, a village's smell, a sibling's laugh, a moment of joy from a life already gone. But the indoctrination systems detected these remnants like impurities. Servo arms adjusted dial settings. Electrographs tightened. Chemical suppressants flooded the bloodstream. Within minutes, the memories dissolved. By the end of the first cycle, A recruit might remember how to take apart a bolter blindfolded, but couldn't remember the sound of his own original voice. And then came the most dangerous tool ever created for the legions: flash training. This wasn't indoctrination. It wasn't education. It was the rapid-fire download of experience into a brain that had never lived it. Combat instincts that took decades for a veteran Astartes to master were compressed into pure neural data and blasted into the recruit's consciousness. Sword technique, marksmanship, battlefield analysis, threat prioritization, squad communication, information poured in like a storm of lightning. But the brain wasn't built for it. Flash training pushed recruits to the brink of neurological collapse. If the mind resisted, it tore itself apart. If it accepted too much too quickly, synapses overloaded. Some Inductii emerged twitching and disoriented, believing they'd fought in battles that never happened. Others collapsed, suffering seizures that left them permanently broken. And some woke up screaming because the implanted memories clashed with fragments of their real lives. A recruit would see himself fighting on a world he'd never visited, killing enemies he'd never known, following orders from a commander he'd never met. The brain cannot reconcile these contradictions, so it breaks or it rewires itself in strange, unpredictable ways. Commanders considered these side effects acceptable losses. After all, the Inductii weren't being shaped into stable citizens or philosophers. They were being shaped into ammunition. The emotional damage was more subtle, more insidious. The indoctrination engines taught Inductii obedience but not understanding, loyalty but not identity, aggression but not purpose. They knew how to fight long before they understood why. They reacted before they thought. They charged before they questioned. They obeyed because the alternative was mental collapse. Sometimes, an Inductii would stare at his own reflection during armor fitting, frowning as if something felt wrong inside his skull. He might touch the Emperor's sigil on his breastplate, knowing he should feel pride, but sensing nothing but emptiness. Or he might whisper a word that meant something once, but now sounded like it belonged to someone else. This loss of self was worst in the early batches. Recruits would forget conversations moments after they happened. Some struggled to recognize squad mates they'd trained with. Others experienced brief flashes of their old lives. Ghost memories that flickered and died like sparks before they could ignite. Veteran Astartes noticed. They saw Inductii hesitate at odd moments, as if their programmed instincts paused for a microsecond to resolve a conflict inside their skull. They saw them flinch at certain sounds, react with sudden aggression to minor stimuli, or freeze entirely when ordered to perform tasks their artificial memories didn't cover. It wasn't incompetence. It was fragmentation. But war doesn't pause for healing, and the legions refused to slow down. Inductii were thrown from indoctrination chambers directly into training halls. The transition was a shock, going from the cold silence of mental rewriting to the deafening chaos of drill masters barking orders, blades clashing, and bolters firing. They moved like machines at first. Perfect stances, perfect strikes, perfect reactions. But no machine is flawless. Sometimes an Inductii would continue firing even after the target fell. Sometimes he would turn too slowly when spoken to. Sometimes he would fight with reckless brutality, overcompensating for the emotional gaps left by erased identity. And sometimes he would break, A recruit might suddenly freeze mid-training, hands trembling as synaptic pathways misfired. Another might collapse to his knees, clutching his head as indoctrinated memories clashed with the last surviving fragments of his real life. Others simply shut down, minds reduced to static. These failures were removed quietly. The legions didn't keep those who couldn't reconcile their implanted purpose. The survivors, those whose minds accepted the rewriting, were praised as successes. They weren't. They were the ones who endured the most profound violation imaginable, the destruction of self. By the time an Inductii stood in full armor for the first time, he no longer had a past. He only had functions, directive patterns, instinct lattices, battle memories he had never lived. And beneath all of it, a void. Because the truth none of the legions admitted, loyalist or traitor, was this: the Inductii weren't fully formed space marines. They were half-finished minds forced into complete bodies. Their indoctrination was not a foundation. It was a patchwork, a temporary fix stretched thin over a fractured psyche. Some hid the damage well. Some turned that inner emptiness into ruthless efficiency. Some embraced the legion so fiercely that loyalty became their only identity. And some were ticking time bombs. The legions gambled with the souls of thousands, because the alternative was losing the war. The Inductii never had a choice. Their will was rewritten, their thoughts rewritten, their instincts rewritten. They were not just made to fight, they were made to only fight. And as the heresy deepened, these rewritten minds would be thrust into battles that would test not just their strength, but the very stability of their manufactured souls. Before dive in Chapter 7, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more updates. Now, let's dive straight into Chapter 7. Chapter 7, The Siege of Terra. Inductii in the fire that ended an age. What happens when thousands of half-formed warriors, stripped of identity, force-grown in desperation, and mentally rewired for obedience, are hurled into the single greatest battle in human history? The Siege of Terra answered that question with brutal clarity. The moment the traitor legions reached the throne world, the galaxy braced for an ending. Not a battle, not a campaign, an ending. Thunderhawks roared across burning skies. Orbital bombardments turned continents into ash. Titan engines shook the ground like the heartbeat of a dying world. And into that apocalypse marched the Inductii, creations of emergency protocols, experiments of gene labs pushed beyond their limits, young warriors who had known only weeks or months of true consciousness. They were not ready, but they were needed. The walls of the Imperial Palace towered like a mountain forged from hope and despair, its battlements overflowing with defenders drawn from every corner of humanity. Soldiers, citizens, custodians, and Astartes. Yet even with all this, the forces loyal to the Emperor were still frighteningly outnumbered. Every legion counted its dead by the thousands. Every regiment fought past exhaustion. Every brotherhood felt the weight of extinction breathing down its neck. For many commanders, the Inductii became the only reinforcements left. Their arrival was a strange sight, not triumphant, not inspiring, just necessary. Some came marching in newly forged armor that still smelled of the forges. Some arrived shaken, skin pale from recent surgeries or hypno-conditioning. Some still bore the scars of indoctrination electrodes on their temples. and some, horrifyingly, showed subtle signs of neural instability even before they entered combat. But none of that mattered. Terra needed every blade. Veterans looked at them and saw ghosts, pale imitations of the brothers they'd lost. Inductii looked at the veterans and saw the lives they were never allowed to grow into. It created a silent tension, a fragile, unspoken grief shared by both sides. But war doesn't give time for reconciliation. The traitor forces crashed into the palace with the fury of a hurricane, and the Inductii were thrown into the storm. In those opening hours, the difference between a seasoned Astartes and an Inductii was painfully visible. Veterans adjusted instantly, fighting with the fluid reflexes of warriors shaped by centuries of battle. Inductii reacted milliseconds too slowly, or milliseconds too fast, firing in bursts of panic or lunging too aggressively at targets already down. Some squads held together by sheer instinct lattice training alone. Others fell into disarray as their indoctrination collided with the reality of battle, a reality no artificial memory could simulate. But Terra was not a battlefield where mistakes went unpunished. Every error cost lives. Every hesitation opened a breach. Every neuron misfire, every flicker of uncertainty, every incomplete mental pathway left by rushed indoctrination risked catastrophe. The legions saw this, and they adapted in the only way they could. Inductii were placed into formations where stability was maintained by veteran sergeants, living anchors holding unstable minds in place. The veterans barked orders with precision, not encouragement. They became shepherds guiding imperfect creations through perfect hell. And gradually, painfully, the Inductii learned. They learned what real war felt like, the screams, the heat, the fear. They learned how different it was from flash training illusions. They learned how heavy their armor felt when exhaustion crept in, how loud their own hearts pounded when adrenaline clashed with indoctrinated calm. They learned pain. They learned loss. They learned reality. And in learning these things, many for the first time, their identity fractures widened. Some Inductii became frighteningly aggressive, throwing themselves into combat as if trying to outrun the instability crackling behind their eyes. Their squad mates noticed them shaking after engagements, whispering to themselves, hands clenching spasmodically at their weapons. Others withdrew into mechanical obedience, silent, emotionless, following orders with dead precision because it was the only clarity they had left. A few broke entirely. During one early skirmish on the palace walls, an Inductii froze mid-engagement, staring at a burning horizon as if seeing a memory that didn't belong to him. His squad mates shouted, firing over his shoulder. He didn't react. When the traitors broke through, he died without raising his bolter. The apothecaries who examined him found synaptic scarring so severe it resembled brain trauma, except it had been inflicted by failed indoctrination, not enemy weapons. This wasn't rare. The immense psychic pressure of Terra, the roars of titans, the screams of the dying, the warp-tainted aura of traitor sorcery, was amplified inside Inductii minds already destabilized by forced indoctrination and accelerated growth. And yet, something remarkable happened. For every Inductii who broke, another rose. For every mind that shattered under pressure, another seemed to strengthen, like a blade quenched in the hottest forge. The chaos of Terra burned away their artificial identities, forcing genuine ones to form. Some Inductii bonded fiercely with veteran commanders. Some found a sense of belonging they had never felt before. Some became terrifyingly effective, fighting with a desperation that came from understanding they were expendable, but choosing to fight anyway. It wasn't honor. It wasn't heritage. It was survival. And through that survival, they earned something the indoctrination chambers had failed to give them. Purpose that came from within, not from programming. Veterans began to notice. A sergeant might glance at an Inductii holding a breach alone for 30 seconds, an eternity in such combat, and feel something shift. A captain might see an Inductii pull a wounded Astartes to safety and realize this wasn't a machine. This was a brother in the making. The siege forced the legions to accept a truth no one wanted to say aloud. The Inductii were no longer replacements. They were the Legion now. By the end of the siege, some companies were composed almost entirely of Inductii, fighting on instinct, desperation, and newfound identity. And when the walls fell, when titans toppled, when the sky turned red with burning atmosphere, these hastily grown warriors stood beside their veteran brothers and refused to break. They weren't perfect. They weren't stable. They weren't fully formed. But they were there. They were fighting. They were bleeding. They were dying for a cause they had only barely begun to understand. And for many veterans, that mattered more than how they were born. When the palace gates shook under bombardment, when the Eternity Wall cracked, when Horus hordes pressed so hard the stone itself screamed, Inductii held the line. And in the darkest hours of the heresy, when the fate of humanity balanced on a blade, the legions realized something profound. The Inductii were not mistakes. They were miracles created under impossible circumstances. But miracles have a price. The trauma of Terra lodged itself deep inside their unstable minds. Some would never recover. Some would never fully adapt. Some would be forever haunted by the contradictions inside their own thoughts. Yet without them, the siege would have ended long before the Emperor ever reached the vengeful spirit. The Inductii arrived as experiments. They became soldiers. They fought as brothers. And they died as Astartes. The fire of Terra didn't just test them. It forged them. And in the smoke of that forging, a final truth became clear. These imperfect sons carried the legions on their backs when perfection was no longer possible. Chapter 8: Aftermath, Erasure, Purges, and the Vanishing Legacy of the Inductii. When the fires of the Horus Heresy finally guttered out, the galaxy did not celebrate. It exhaled, slow, wounded, shaken, and then it looked at what remained. The legions were barely recognizable. Their culture was shattered, their numbers shredded, their pride fractured. And standing among the ruins were the Inductii, warriors who had been necessary during the war, but inconvenient afterward. War births monsters, peace buries them. As the Imperium began its desperate reconstruction, the Inductii found themselves in a strange limbo. During the heresy, they were praised for their usefulness, thrown into the thickest battles, relied upon when all else crumbled. But now everything had changed. The legions were being broken apart. The Codex Astartes was being drafted. Robot Guilliman was reshaping the galaxy's military doctrine. And the Imperium, terrified of another betrayal, began to demand purity, discipline, and strict gene line stability. The Inductii represented the opposite. They were rushed, irregular, unstable, created from desperation, not tradition. So the first thing the Imperium did was hide them. Official histories of the heresy began to omit details. The Administratum scrubbed mentions of emergency protocols. The Mechanicus sealed their files under layers of classification. Remembrancers who tried to document the Inductii's creation found their work corrected, edited, or destroyed entirely. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't contempt. It was fear. Fear that admitting how far the Imperium had bent its sacred practices would make people question the strength of the Astartes, the Emperor's vision, the purity of the gene seed. Fear that the truth of the Inductii would expose how fragile the legions had been. Fear that using shortcuts once might tempt commanders to use them again. So the Imperium chose the easiest route. They buried the evidence. Some Inductii were quietly reassigned into new chapter formations. They were given new heraldry, new identities, new oaths. But few chapters wanted to acknowledge recruits forged under emergency conditions. The Codex demanded structured ranks, slow growth, strict purity. Inductii, with their fragile psyches and accelerated biology, didn't fit anywhere cleanly. Many new chapters welcomed them only out of necessity. Some captains saw them as liabilities, ticking time bombs of gene line instability. Others saw them as living reminders of the worst days of the heresy, ghosts they didn't want haunting their fresh beginnings. A few chapters embraced them, recognizing the strength forged through sheer survival. These Inductii became legends, grim veterans who had fought at Terra and lived. But even their stories were often stripped of detail, as if their origins were stains instead of scars. The political cleansing went further than anyone expected. Some Inductii still carried psychological fractures from rushed indoctrination. These flaws, tolerated during the war, now became grounds for quiet removal. Reassignment was the official term. What it meant varied by region. Some were sent to remote outposts unlikely to see combat. Some were absorbed into auxiliary forces. Some were quietly retired, given duties that guaranteed they would fade from records. And some simply vanished, removed by apothecaries under the guise of gene seed extraction protocols. It was a purge without banners, without accusations, without executions. A purge carried out through silence. Then there were the Inductii who carried the heaviest burdens. Combat trauma, neural instability, and memory fragmentation. Many of these warriors tried to serve in the newly formed chapters, but found themselves unable to adapt to peacetime discipline. Their artificial training had shaped them for constant war. Without it, the cracks widened. Some developed violent outbursts. Some retreated emotionally into hardened shells. Some struggled with phantom memories implanted during flash training. Some simply wandered the halls of their monasteries, lost between identities they never fully owned. Chapters didn't know how to handle them. There were no protocols for warriors whose minds had been forcibly overwritten. There were no provisions for psychological recovery. The Astartes had never been expected to need therapy. But the Inductii weren't ordinary Astartes. They were the consequences of desperation. The Mechanicum, meanwhile, began conducting purity audits across the legions, identifying deviations from standard gene seed practices. They documented every abnormality found in Inductii gene lines, marking files with cold precision. Unstable osmodula development, incomplete neuroglottis adaptation, unpredictable combat urge spikes, memory lattice corruption. These weren't just notes. They were reasons to remove the subject from operational roles. And so, many Inductii were quietly filtered out. Not killed, not executed, just removed, erased from formations, lost in restructuring, named in logs that no one would ever read again. For the Inductii who remained, survival meant reinvention. They had to bury their origins as deeply as the Imperium buried their history. They adopted Legion rituals they'd never grown up with. They memorized myths they'd never learned naturally. They watched the veterans of the heresy fade away, leaving behind traditions the Inductii pretended to understand. Some succeeded beautifully. These Inductii became cornerstones of new chapters, battle brothers whose strength and resilience built legacies that endured for millennia. Only a handful of archivists would ever know the truth of their accelerated birth. Others struggled. The ritual chants felt hollow. The battle hymns felt foreign. The Codex Astartes felt constricting after wartime chaos. They were soldiers shaped for a world of fire, now expected to stand calm and disciplined in a world that wanted to forget their existence. The tragedy is that no one asked them what they wanted. They were created to serve. They were used to survive. And once the war ended, they were expected to disappear. For some Inductii, this quiet erasure was a relief. They had lived through enough horror. For others, it was a betrayal deeper than any wound. They had fought at Terra. They had bled for the Emperor. They had held the line while the galaxy crumbled. And now they felt like ghosts. The final sting of insult came when the genetic processes used to create them were locked away forever. The Mechanicus sealed the protocols. The Administratum marked them as non-standard emergency measures. The legions avoided discussing them even among themselves. Some whispered that Guilliman had personally ordered the secrecy, fearing that future wars might tempt commanders to repeat the shortcut. Others claimed that Dorn supported the erasure, believing that only pure and fully formed Astartes should carry the Imperial legacy forward. Still others believed the Imperium hid the Inductii out of shame, not because they were flawed, but because they were necessary. Because their existence proved how close the Imperium came to breaking. Today, scattered records remain. Fragments, half-truths, corrupted data logs. Historians piece together their story like archaeologists reconstructing a lost culture. But the Inductii themselves? Their voices are faint. Their names mostly lost. Their stories drowned by the reforms that followed the heresy. And yet, in the undercurrent of Astartes mythology, in the quiet traditions kept alive by chapters who never forgot their roots, there are hints, tiny sparks, of the Inductii's legacy. Stories told in whispers, songs about warriors who never should have survived but did. Oaths carved into armor by Astartes who refused to be forgotten. The Imperium may have buried the Inductii, but the galaxy they saved still carries their scars. Chapter 9, Legacy of Monsters. Were the Inductii warriors, victims, or warnings? What becomes of an army created in panic? Once the panic is gone. That question has haunted the Imperium for 10,000 years, drifting like an echo through the vaults of fortress monasteries and the dim memory chambers of old veterans. The Inductii were forged in emergency, shaped for crisis, born in terror, and then abandoned to a galaxy that no longer needed them but couldn't bear to admit what they were. But the truth is simple and brutal. The Imperium survived the Horus Heresy because of the Inductii, and the Imperium buried the Inductii because of what that truth meant. As the millennia crawled forward after the Siege of Terra, the legions dissolved into smaller chapters. Glory was washed with new heraldry. Shame was hidden behind polished armor and revised doctrine. The Astartes began rebuilding themselves into symbols rather than soldiers, icons of discipline, stability, and absolute loyalty. There was no room for the messy, improvised reality of the Inductii in that vision. Some Inductii who had survived the heresy quietly slipped into the ranks of new chapters during the Great Reformation. They fought in the early crusades that rebuilt imperial space. They trained neophytes who never knew their teachers had been forged in emergency gene labs. They sat in council chambers as respected veterans while their own origins remained locked away behind sealed Mechanicus protocols. These were the success stories, the warriors who adapted, endured, and carved their place into the Imperium's new order. But for every Inductii who thrived, there were others who found themselves lost. Many chapters adopted cultures so steeped in ritual and history that Inductii simply couldn't fully join them. These new traditions felt foreign, like stories written for someone else. The songs were strange. The rites felt hollow. The memories implanted during indoctrination clashed with their new identities until some Inductii felt like intruders in their own armor. Some chapters recognized this quietly and reassigned them to roles where they would be less visible. They were honored, praised, and then placed where their presence wouldn't complicate the chapter's lineage. And some Inductii, unable to reconcile who they were with what they had been forced to become, drifted into silence. They became the quiet ones, the warriors who spoke little, who sat alone during feast rituals, who stared too long at the chapter's banners as if searching for something that never belonged to them. Those were the Inductii whose internal fractures never healed. Occasionally, deep inside the vaults of an ancient monastery, a chaplain would discover a piece of writing, a journal fragment, a scratched set of words carved into plasteel, a recorded reflection left by an Astartes who had no family history, no true name, no past before the indoctrination chamber. Some fragments were bitter, some were confused, some were peaceful in their resignation. All were heartbreaking, yet even in their isolation the Inductii left marks. They taught fighting tactics that only desperation could invent. They introduced ritual variations unique to their accelerated upbringing. They carried cultural fragments from dozens of worlds, languages, gestures, battlefield aphorisms. Across 10,000 years, these tiny contributions spread like quiet roots through the chapters that never realized their customs came from warriors whose names were erased. The Blood Angels still whisper battlefield phrases that were born from Inductii subgroups who learned to survive their own gene seed flaws. The Iron Hands maintain certain reinforcement drills shaped by those early batches who had been trained amid scarcity, cybernetics, and trauma. The White Scars inherited speed rituals refined by recruits who blended Chagorian tradition with memories from far-flung worlds. Even the Ultramarines, rigid and structured, retain subtle traces of Inductii formations in their tactical response doctrines. Their influence is everywhere, but their identity is nowhere. And that may be the greatest tragedy. The Imperium's historians often portray the Inductii as necessary but flawed, useful but unrefined, essential but dangerous. It's a description that feels clinical, sterile, and completely detached from the reality of what these warriors endured. Because the Inductii weren't just a protocol. They weren't just an emergency measure. They weren't just stopgap Marines. They were children, yes, children, force-grown into adult bodies, thrown into indoctrination chambers, rewritten psychologically, stripped of everything that could have made them human, and then catapulted into the most catastrophic war humanity ever faced. And they did not break. They did not run. They held the walls of Terra. They fought chaos itself. They stood beside primarchs whose shadows threatened to crush them. They died by the thousands without ever hearing their own names spoken with affection. If anything, they weren't the Imperium's shame. They were the Imperium's sacrifice. But the galaxy does not always honor sacrifices. Sometimes it forgets them on purpose. As centuries passed, the Inductii faded into myth. Mentions of them exist only in obscure Mechanicus logs, cryptic Legion memoirs, and contradictory chronicles. A few chapters have oral traditions that refer to the unnamed brothers or the emergency-born. But these are scattered, inconsistent, and often misinterpreted. What remains is a paradox. The Astartes are symbols of flawless discipline, yet some of their greatest heroes were created in violation of every rule. The Imperium claims purity, yet it owes its survival to impure methods. The legions speak of honor, yet they buried the warriors who saved them. But not all stories stay buried forever. In the dim libraries of remote fortress monasteries, inquisitorial archivists have uncovered data shards that hint at a deeper legacy. Some suggest that Inductii gene lines still exist within certain chapters, diluted but persistent. Others claim that entire successor chapters may unknowingly descend from emergency batches created during the heresy's darkest days. There are whispers that some Inductii, those who survived long past the Reformation, became high-ranking officers whose influence shaped chapter doctrine for centuries. If true, then the Inductii are not merely forgotten. They are hidden inside the very heart of the Imperium's elite. And then there is the final, uncomfortable question. Was this wrong? Should their history have been cleansed? Should their existence have been buried? Was secrecy the price of stability? Or was it cowardice dressed as order? Historians argue endlessly. The Imperium never answers. And the Inductii are not here to speak for themselves, but their legacy remains. In every bolt gun drill that echoes a tactic once born in desperation. In every chapter ritual carrying the faint fingerprints of unknown brothers. In every victory achieved by Astartes who trained under mentors with hidden pasts. In every whisper of Terran-born veterans who still remember the pale recruits who fought like demons. The Inductii saved the Imperium, and the Imperium erased them. Yet somehow, through scars, stories, echoes, and bloodlines, they endure. They endure in the doctrines. They endure in the legends. They endure in the iron will of the Astartes who fight today. They endure in the knowledge that even flawed creations can perform miracles when the galaxy demands it. And perhaps that is the final truth the Imperium never wanted spoken aloud. The Inductii were neither monsters nor mistakes. They were proof that humanity, even at its most desperate, can forge strength out of impossibility. Warriors shaped in panic who fought with purpose. Victims who became heroes. Experiments who earned the right to be called brothers. Their story is not one of shame. It is one of survival, one of sacrifice, one of unintended greatness. And though the Imperium may hide their legacy, the galaxy remembers,